Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. Welcome to the USA, or America as some people like to call it. That's America with an M, where you can pray your way to success, lose that irritating belly fat, reverse your mortgage, buy virtual real estate. The guarantees in this country know no limits because they're offered to the innocent and the unsuspecting by a bunch of con artists and bullshitters. How do you spot them? Because sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not. So we're going to talk about that today a little bit. And we're going to frame this whole issue as storytelling gone wrong. Not just the stories that we're told that are lies, but also the stories that we tell ourselves when we're being lied to by these con artists. Storytelling gone wrong. And I'm thinking about an interview I saw not long ago with science fiction writer Ken Liu, Liu, and I really like his work. So I was watching him do interviews and listening to his process of being a creative writer as well as a scientist. And he said that he had a sort of crisis of faith during the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, because of all the lies and conspiracy theories that were being peddled. And it really showed him the dark side of storytelling. So in the work that I've been presenting for a number of years now, actually, I talk about storytelling as a force for change, both individual and collective. And in fact, at my website, chalquist.com, if you click on the courses tab and scroll down for a bit, you'll find some stuff on storytelling. I have a whole course on it, actually. But that emphasis is about stories for transformation. What Ken Liu is talking about, and I agree with him, is storytelling as a form of not a lore way, which is my term for the paths that we take, the lore-filled paths that we take, of wonder and enchantment, but a lie way, the dark side. So he's worth looking up. I saw the interview on YouTube, and that's what we want to talk about here, storytelling gone wrong, and also the negative trickster, if we speak about this in mythological and archetypal terms. The negative tricksters among us, and why we're vulnerable. So I come at this from a couple of different perspectives. One is that I've had special training spotting such people, and particularly when they're men. And I'll also say at this point that even with special training, you can still fall for it. And when you do, and this is my first suggestion of the day, try not to be too hard on yourself. Instead, do a self-inventory. Like, why did this happen? And what was the vulnerability in me? How can I do better? Things like that, right? So I've also had a lot of bitter experience, as many of us have, being taken in. And one that's up for me right now is my mother was ripped off for $36,000. She's in her 80s, and so I caught the person who did it. It was a nursing assistant. She was arrested, convicted, had her license taken away. And although I did catch her, I wish I had caught her sooner. And incidentally, if you're interested in the details, look up Superior Court of San Diego, case number CE 406397, and you can find out more about it. So, even in my case, when I know what to look for, sometimes I still fall prey to these people. Not very often anymore, but it can happen to anybody. And especially people like me who don't naturally think in terms of bullshitting other people. So that's something to realize right up front. That we can, and any of us, we can all be fooled, right? So let's have some suggestions for keeping your eyes open and trying to understand when to have your guard up. Because there's two extremes to avoid here. One of them is to be so innocent, pseudo-innocent is actually the right word, that anybody takes you in. And the other extreme is to be so suspicious that you don't trust anybody, which is equally no good. In fact, the hyper suspicious people often have a moment of weakness where they trust somebody and they're even more vulnerable to hucksters and bullshitters and con artists in those situations. So we want to avoid that too. The keynote here is discernment, right? And like I said, keeping your eyes open. How do you do that? So I've noticed among other Americans that one of the things we're not good at, that people from other countries are actually much better at, is reading an ordinary human expression. And I wonder sometimes if it's because so many of us were raised on sitcoms where everything is staged to the point of being ludicrous. Oh, I didn't see you over by the window. I mean, it's just insulting when you actually watch this stuff with any discernment. And, we're raised to think that's not only funny, but to think that's normal. And so as a result, we're perhaps there's other factors too, but we're poor readers of expressions. So I have an exercise to suggest for you. And it's one I've done many times. It's a good one to do also as a refresher. So somebody who's up in the news right now as a bullshitter is George Santos, but you can take your pick. American politics is basically dominated by hucksters and bullshitters, so with, of course, notable exceptions. So pick your favorite. I like George Santos because he's so obvious about it and useful in terms of awareness raising. And so if you can find a speech, or actually better would be an interview, find an interview with him and watch it without sound and see what you can discern from his expressions. Now, one thing I notice when I watch his interviews with or without sound is that he is smirking all the way through pretty much until the points where he gets upset about something. He has a narcissistic rage when somebody questions him about something he's sensitive about. But otherwise, he's very smooth and, well, I did it this way and I'm going to, I've learned my lesson and, that kind of thing, right? But look for the smirk. I think of it as the sociopathic smirk. And you see it on a lot of faces of people who actually are sociopaths, judging from their public behavior anyway. And so look for that. So that's one thing to be aware of in terms of spotting a bullshitter. Here's another one to look for. And I sort of mentioned it briefly just now, easy eloquence. I worked at a school where one of the people at the top was like this, and he was so reassuring, and he would get up in front of a group of people and say, well, I understand that you're all worried about such and such, and let me just give you the straight story about it and then lie his ass off, right? So, easy eloquence, especially if there's a hint of contempt in it. And here, again, you have to draw on your expression sensing powers and try to develop them a bit. Now, certainly not all eloquent, smooth people are bullshitters, but that's one of several things that you might want to notice when you're wondering whether somebody's handing you a line or not. Easy eloquence, usually coupled with a great deal of charisma. Charismatic people in the public eye, especially in this country, are so often associated with some kind of criminal behavior that I actually have a bit of a bias against charismatic people sometimes that I have to keep an eye on because of that. So if you see someone with a lot of charisma and you really want to believe them, be careful. Another thing to look for is evasion of direct questions. And the evasion oftentimes is not a few words, it's a story. So I'm thinking of Elizabeth Holmes, the infamous corporate bullshitter, who, when asked specific questions about the medical aspects of her operation, would veer off into stories about her suffering grandfather. So that's something to watch. You ask a direct question and what you get back is evasion and appeals to your sympathy, or you get it turned back on you, which is a huge indicator. Sometimes when I would interview men to get into our men's groups for court-referred guys who had been arrested for violent crimes, done some jail time or prison time, and then they needed a year of mandatory therapy, so we would interview him before we let him into our group. And sometimes when I asked him direct questions, they'd throw it back on me. Well, why are you asking me this? Aren't you just an instrument of the courts? I mean, why should I tell you this? Who's your boss and stuff like that. So it's not that hard to spot if you're ready for it. And I would respond to it, incidentally, by putting it right back on them where it began. Um, so sometimes I would tell them things like, well, what you need to focus on is giving me straight answers because basically I'm the one who decides whether you get into the group or not. So, about what I just asked you, what's the truth about this? Oftentimes, this tactic goes under the trendy word gaslighting, and it can be a form of gaslighting, which basically means trying to make you think you're crazy for even asking a question that you should be asking. So sometimes BSers will do that. But anyway, it's something to watch for. It's not always, strictly speaking, gaslighting. Sometimes it's just a tactic to keep from answering truthfully. Another thing I look for, and this applies more to people who are just lying a lot rather than being sociopaths, people with some kind of conscience don't like to lie if they don't have to. And so when they do, there's often some sort of a hesitation. And when I would do interviews, sometimes I would go down a list of pretty standard mental health questions, and then I would get to the criminal behavior part. And I would say, so any, in this situation, any violence involved, any hitting, any this, any that. And I would ask in exactly the same tone as I asked about healthcare questions or anything else. And I wouldn't even look at the person when I was asking because I'm listening for the pause or for the uncomfortable shuffling around in one's seat. And it's not true. This is another form all by itself of bullshitting. It's not true that there are specific nonverbal behaviors that you can identify in strangers to tell if they're lying or not. Um, that's being sold right now, as a form of lie detection, which itself is, I think, a lie. Most people who are real experts in spotting liars, and I'm thinking of interrogators and police interrogators, people like that, intelligence officers, they'll often tell you, I don't go by that. I don't think there's any. If someone looks up to the right and then up to the left, it just means they're looking somewhere because they're thinking. So it's more a matter of looking for breaks in the pattern. An honest person will have a certain pattern in responses and body languages. And the responses and body languages will change, but they'll have a certain rhythm that suddenly stops if they're worried about getting caught lying. Very often, though, your real con artist, they don't care about lying. I mean, they do it for a living, basically. They lie to everybody. So they don't have any hesitation in lying like the rest of us do. Another thing to look into, especially if you're going to be working a lot with somebody or paying them for some kind of expensive services, is to look into their background and look for gaps. There was years ago when I was chairing a department in the academic world, we were hiring faculty, and there was a guy with gaps in his resume. And at first, he actually left the dates off of different places that he had worked. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. So I asked him about it in the interview. I didn't email him about it. I wanted to look at him while I was asking. And that was another suspicious thing. Intermittent internet trouble whenever we asked hard questions. So that by itself was kind of a giveaway. But I said, you need to submit a CV, a resume, basically, that has correct dates on it. And so he did, and I looked at it, and there were huge gaps here and there. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, I took leaves of absence, I did this, I did that. All of which may have been true, but what it looked like was that he had worked just long enough in a place to get fired, and then he went somewhere else, did the same thing, got fired, and so on. So it was something that we wondered about. And when I asked him about it point blank, he got huffy about it and defensive, which all by itself is an indicator of a bullshitter. And then we just said, no thanks, and walked away. Something else to look for, especially where money is involved, is that bullshitters and con artists try to get you to make a decision immediately. And unfortunately, so do reputable salespeople when they've been taught the high pressure school of trying to market something. So sometimes when people do that, they're actually not bullshitting you, they're just trying to make a sale. So you can't take any one of these things I'm mentioning and say this is the definitive indicator. You're looking for a whole syndrome or a whole pattern of misbehavior. And the same with this one. If somebody tries to rush you into something, could be their background and their training, but it's definitely something to notice. And by the way, whether it's an honest attempt to sell you something or not, you have a magic power that you should never throw away, and that's the power to wait. And so I'm thinking of times when, for instance, I'm shopping for a car, and the person on the lot says, "Well, you seem to like this car. How can we close this deal?" And my response usually is, "We can't. I have a lot of other cars to look at, so I'll get back to you." Another thing to check for is what I call pulpit rhythms, where somebody repeats and repeats a phrase to hammer it into you over and over. We will do this and that and this. We will stand up for whatever. We will blah 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 blah. Right? It's a form of hypnosis, really. And politicians, when they do this, they often point at people too. What is it with politicians and pointing? You know, I guess it's their way of saying, I actually know personally somebody in the audience, right? I wish they'd stop pointing. Um, in any case, yeah, the pulpit rhythms, an attempt to convince, so I would be wary of that. I would also look for false empathy. Uh, I think of it as cold empathy. And this is where people make a comment that sounds empathic but is actually meant just to get on your good side. So they'll say things like, "Well, that this must be such a dilemma for you," or "Yeah, I know where you're coming from. I was in a situation like this too once, and boy, it was frustrating." And they might say what sounds like really accurate things, but they're still doing it to just get on your good side. It doesn't feel like real empathy. It feels like a trick when you're honest with yourself and you don't fall for it. A sociopath who was interviewing for one of my groups tried that once, and he said, I think it was our second interview. He said, "You're looking kind of tired today," and I said, "Yeah, I'm just tired of all the bullshitting that comes my way. Are you going to show up for the first group or not? Because if you don't, you know what the consequence is: more prison time, right?" He didn't show up, of course. And the last one I'll mention, which you see in the political arena a lot as well as religion and finance, is an attempt to appeal to your fear. There is stated outright or just by implication, if you don't do such and such, then these terrible things will happen. They're coming for this. These people will break in. These people will invade your jobs, your homes, your whatever it is, right? God will punish you, whatever it is. The appeal to fear. And I would actually go so far as to say that anybody who appeals to fear, that probably is a one symptom indicator of bullshitting right there. If anyone who does that is a bullshitter, it's a strong arm tactic that no ethical person should be using to try to bully you into doing whatever it is that they want you to do. You know, an interesting thing about bullshitters, especially sociopaths, is that they don't learn from past mistakes. But we can. We can do the self inquiry. Ask ourselves, why did I want to believe this? Why did I allow this person inside my guard? And from there, we can have a better relationship to the trickster dimension of our existence. Trickster has a lot to say, a lot to tell us about being sharp, being aware, being on our guard. And armed with that kind of knowledge, we have a better chance of keeping our guard up when we need to and otherwise relaxing into a more satisfying way to be. Thank you.